Live. Okay, so we are now recording. So I will say again for my listeners and for our audience, thank you so much for joining us on Pontifex. And it is my absolute pleasure to my audience to introduce Pope Michael.
Okay, I'm glad to be here.
So, Pope Michael, we have some questions to go over with you about the state of the Catholic Church, your papacy, how it all came to be. And most of my audience is coming to this podcast from a place of understanding papal history as history. We talk about the popes as like movers and people who had a tremendous impact on history, whether that is nations or kings or countries or wars. So they may not have the theological background that you do. So I'd like to start off by asking you first. You were raised a staunch Catholic, but after the Second Vatican Council in 1965, you and your family became CityVacantists.
Well, we
So,
didn't become CityVaticanist immediately,
okay,
although uh, we were concerned. We were still going in to the regular churches and watched what was called the changes. I mean, you
right,
didn't go in one week and have a Latin Tridentine Mass, and the next week the Novus Ordo. It was a
right.
gradual change starting in about 64 was the first decree after the decree on the liturgy in 63. So they started putting things into the vernacular. For
Mm-hmm.
instance, my first communion, which would have been around 65, the canon was still in Latin, but parts of the Mass were already in the vernacular. And eventually it was all in the vernacular. Yes, that happened in 68. I had to stop and think a minute because that's one of the things I'm serializing on the Pope Speaks over at the Vatican in Exile is a history of what went on because most people are new to this, and new would be someone who came into this in 75.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us are veterans. For instance, in 65, a group of concerned Catholics in Oklahoma City pulled their children out of the CCD classes because at best they were worthless
Mm-hmm.
and started teaching them the faith on their own. I joined that in about early 67.
Okay.
On found that. So, I mean, a lot of things were going on before Archbishop Lefebvre even started the Society of St. Pius X.
Right. Right. So for our audience's benefit, can you explain what sedevacantism is and what that belief means?
Well, basically, it comes from the Latin sede vacante, which are two words. And originally it was two words. When the term was coined, it was probably about 78. It might have been earlier, but that's when I first became acquainted with the particular term. But sede vacante is what happens after the death of one pope and before the election of the next pope. So, for instance, after uh, Joseph Ratzinger resigned and before Jorge Bergoglio was elected, the
Mhm.
conciliar church were sede vacantists because
Yes.
they believed the seat was empty, which is what that
Mhm.
means when you translate. We believe that the man in Rome was not pope. Now, an offshoot of sedevacantism is what's called conclavism. That's those who wanted to elect a pope.
Right. And so your family and the changes came about in the church after the Second Vatican Council because the sedevacantists believe that parts of the Second Vatican Council are heretical. So what parts of the council are condemnable and why?
Now I decide, well, rather than print something out, I get out my book. Will the real Catholic Church please stand up? And I bookmark. Okay, we'll go to the decree on the liturgy, which all but four of the bishops at Vatican II voted for.
Mhm.
All the traditionalist bishops signed because they don't claim the contrary. Archbishop Lefebvre claims to not have signed two later documents. So that
Right.
implies he signed this document, or else he would have mentioned it.
Mhm.
Let's see. So in here, Yes, in my book, I compare the Constitution on the Liturgy with the Jansenist Synod of Pistua
Okay.
because they sound a lot alike. That was condemned in a bull Auctorum Fidei centuries ago.
Yes.
Okay, quote from Vatican II. For this purpose, the rites are to be simplified, due care being taken to preserve their substance. Elements which, with the passage of time, came to be duplicated or added with but little advantage are now to be discarded. We go over to the Jansenist Synod Pistua. The proposition of the Synod, by which it shows itself eager to remove the cause through which, in part, there has been induced a forgetfulness of the principles of the order of the liturgy, by recalling it, that is the liturgy, to a greater simplicity of rites, etc. But that's not the worst thing. We get further on in the decree from Vatican II, we find the heresy of modernism. And in fact, we have to go clear back to a supporting decree to Rubricarum Instructum, which John 23rd signed in 1960, which changed the rubrics for the calendar, the missal, and the breviary. And that's what your more, I would call them liberal traditionalists, such as the Society of St. Pius X, on into the Indult, used that particular calendar. Nothing wrong with revising the calendar. Pius
Right.
XII did it, St. Pius X did it. I have to look and see who else did it. But it's the principle upon which they did it. Now, quote from this supporting decree. In preparing or revising the historical lessons of feasts of whatever class, the following should be observed. The commonplace should be avoided. False or inappropriate passages should be deleted or corrected. The proposition false, what they are saying in essence is that the church has lied to us through the liturgy and we have to fix this.
Okay.
So, in other words, the historical lessons are lies in some cases. And this is repeated in Vatican II in the decree on the liturgy, because Pope Pius XII condemns these errors. For this reason, whenever there was a question defining a truth revealed by God, the sovereign pontiff and the councils in their recourse to the theological sources, as they are called, have not seldom drawn many an argument from the sacred science of the liturgy. In other words, in defining a doctrine, one of the places they go for guidance is, what does the church say in the liturgy?
Right.
There's a book, where we got the Bible, and that's how they determined in part which books go into the Bible and which don't. They were already in use in the liturgy before the canon of the Bible was set down.
By Pope Damasus the First.
Was it Pope Damasus first? Yeah, I don't have all of that in my head because I focus more on these things. And then we can go into the Constitution on Divine Revelation. For as the centuries succeed one another, the Church constantly moves forward toward the fullness of divine truth until the words of God reach their complete fulfillment in here. So what they're saying is doctrine is incomplete. It's over time we discovered. Well, one of the principles in defining a doctrine is the Church looks clear back to Scripture and the Church Fathers. What do they teach on this question? It's not the only thing defining a doctrine might do is we're setting this down and we're saying this is Catholic teaching. To go against it is heretical. And then I've got like 4 or 5 other things in this book. Oh, well, yes, this is interesting. In Lumen Gentium, it says, but the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator, in the first place among whom are the Muslims. They profess to hold the faith of Abraham, and together with us they adore the one merciful God, mankind's judge on the last day. Now, if you take a look over at the Quran and there are inscriptions on the Dome of the Rock, Muslims reject the doctrine of the Trinity.
Right.
And I've done this in a presentation. I have 2 stick figures. I call them James and John. Now, James worships one God, and John might worship a different God, but they're both monotheists. And so, if James and John both worship the same God, then they either both worship the true God or both worship a false God.
Right.
Now, if James and John worship two different gods, we worship God, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Muslims worship Allah, which is translated in English would be God, but it's a different God because they reject specifically the Trinity. So if you have two monotheists, only one of them can worship the true God. Now, both of them could also worship false gods because we have this false idea that if you're a monotheist, we all worship the same God, and it's just simply not true.
Right. And so in the liturgy or in the pronouncements of the Second Vatican Council, they're not only simplifying and losing the art of what's being said and the truth of what's being said, but you also this what you're talking about now is more this idea of conciliarism, which is more embracing that came out of that of different religions, correct?
That's a fruit of this because Lumen Gentium, that's, I think, one of the ones Archbishop Lefebvre said he didn't sign, uh, leads into that and is promoting false ecumenism. Now, we certainly will talk with non Catholics, non Christians, etc. But when we talk, we're going to say, this is what we believe. Here's why we
Hmm.
believe it. You're
Right.
welcome to come join us and accept this, but we're not going to minimize doctrine.
Right.
We're not going
And
to de emphasize it. We are going to hold it, this is true, and therefore we hold the contrary is false.
and therefore what was written in Vatican Council makes it heretical because it's minimizing those
Right.
pieces.
It's denying doctrines of the faith.
Right.
And I mean, you
And
can go
so,
online and look up heresies of Vatican II, and several places have pulled out a lot more than I did. I
mm,
focused on the decree on the liturgy because it was, I think, the first decree signed. All but four voted for it. We don't
right.
know if they refused to sign it, but all the bishops that are involved in traditionalism did sign it. Therefore, they signed a heretical document and resigned any office they have in the church.
Because this is this idea of lactate sententiae, which is that by signing and adhering to an heretical document, they are preemptively resigning their position.
Right.
Right. And this is what the Sedevacantist believe about John the 23rd, John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict the 16th, and Francis, and all of the cardinals and bishops, because they adhere to the documents of the Second Vatican Council and therefore preemptively are not legitimate in their position.
That only applies to John Paul I and II, Benedict, and Francis,
Okay.
because that's something that was the Sedevacantist position way back. Because in the early 70s, after we left the Novus Ordo, the conciliar
Hmm.
church, we were all implicitly Sedevacantists in our hearts. We didn't have a name for it, but how can a pope give us this garbage we keep hearing from the pulpits? Which that's what drove us out of there. It wasn't the Novus Ordo. It's the one thing that got our attention. Hold it. I've been walking out on sermons because they sounded wrong. My dad
Hmm.
walked out on two. I know of another man. He had a large family, filled a whole pew. I forget what the priest was preaching on, but it was heretical. He gets up, looks down at his wife at the other end of the pew, and says, Costello's out in a loud voice, and proceeds to march right down the center aisle.
That would have been a sight to see.
I'm sure it would have been. But that's the type of man he was. He didn't, like sneak out.
Right.
He made a bold statement.
And that would have been very impactful for the people who were present, who might have been
Right,
questioning what
right.
they were
So, we
believing.
were all questioning. We didn't know what was going on. But once the Novus Ordo came out, for most of us, that helped us focus. All right, hold it. This came out of all this mess we've been questioning. It's time that church has left us.
Mm,
We
okay.
didn't leave the church, they
Right.
left us by heresy.
And so to define those terms, Novus Ordo and Conciliar Church, since we will be using them a lot, Novus Ordo referring to the changes that came into the Catholic Church post Second Vatican
Well,
Council.
basically, when you talk about the Novus Ordo, it's the change in the Mass mainly. Although they
Right.
changed the rites of most of the other sacraments. And in 74, I think it's Insuratio Liturgica, uh, Paul VI, because some people, when they were translating from the Latin that came out from the Vatican into the various vernaculars, they were fixing the rites of the sacraments. And he said, no,
Hmm.
no, no, don't do that. We change the essential rites of the sacraments. It's right there in the decree.
Hmm. And
And
that's
so, yeah,
and that
so I
kicks
mean,
off the Novus Ordo.
right,
Okay. And the conciliar church, when we refer to that, it's what people, as let's say the general public, would consider the Catholic Church because of this conciliarism that they are
right.
expressing,
Yeah,
the
that's a term
heretical church.
that was actually either as of the closing speech of Paul VI for the council. He
Yes.
called it the Church of the Council, which some translated as conciliar church. And then some of the negotiations between Lefebvre and the Vatican, the term was brought up again. And so to distinguish us from that church, we call it the conciliar church because we
Right.
are the Catholic Church.
Right. So, in breaking with the conciliar church or having the church leave you, as you said, you became a sedevacantist, as you
Right,
said,
right,
and you and other sedevacantists decided to elect a new pope in this conclavism. People who wanted to elect a new pope, to have
right,
a pope who wasn't following a heretical line.
right,
And this conclave resulted in your election.
right.
So, how was that conclave that elected you determined? And are you able to say who participated?
Uh, yes, I can do that, but that's at the end of the story. The idea of electing a pope goes clear back to the early 1970s. Father
Hmm.
Joaquin Sainz Arriaga from Mexico, who was an
Okay.
expert for his bishop at Vatican II.
Mm.
Right? So he had contacts in Rome. Well, he wrote a book called CityVaticanist, which is not in translation from the Spanish.
I
Well,
would read it.
yes, I'm sure you would. He also wrote the New Montanian Church, which is in translation. Okay, so he and some others in Mexico got together, trying to sort things out. He determined the papacy is vacant, so the next step is to elect a pope. So
Hmm.
he had friends in Rome. He flew to Rome and looked up the conservative cardinals to see if he couldn't get them to start doing something.
Right.
Well, they apparently refused. I forget what it said because I don't have a copy of the article from. It's a publication called Veritas, which came out of Louisville, Kentucky, and translated something he'd sent in to them into English. Reporting, he's basically reporting back to anyone who would listen. I bombed out with the cardinals. So the next step was to go to the bishops. And in May of 1976, he and two other priests came from Mexico to visit Archbishop Lefebvre in the Houston, Texas area
Hmm.
to discuss the election of a pope. And there were about 1,000 people, 500 from the Houston area at that society chapel, and about 500 of us came from central United States for the confirmations, Saturday and Sunday. Well, the priest, of course, came on a Saturday, having something to do on Sundays. Several of the people present, including Dr. Benjamin Franklin Dryden, I forget what his doctorate is. He's not a medical doctor, I know that, but he had a doctorate. He could speak Spanish. He spoke with these priests, and they were totally open. We're here to talk to Lefebvre about electing a pope.
Mm.
Well, apparently they got nowhere. Father Sainz died under mysterious circumstances about 2 months later in Houston, Texas. If you look up the Wikipedia page, it says something totally different. But I heard this 30, 35 years ago. So
Right.
that's closer to the time. Well, the other two priests still carried on.
Hmm.
And Dryden he went home and he started looking into it. And he wrote an article on it, which I think I put on Scrib D. Yes. Uh, these two priests, they went back home trying to figure out what to do. And that's how Bishop Peter Martin Din Took comes into the picture. He consecrated them as bishops to preserve the order of bishop until the papal election could be assembled.
Okay.
So, and that was discussed in several meetings with traditionalist priests in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Well, two of the Took line bishops got into a squabble about the time Bishop Took died, and they split from each other, and the idea of electing a pope kind of died out.
Right.
Well, it didn't die out completely because there were several other people thinking about it. I had heard about the idea of electing a pope, and in fact, in 1983, I wrote a letter to all of my friends why I was quitting traditionalism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you can find that online. And so one of the things I put in there, because I'd heard about electing a pope, if anyone knows anything about electing a pope, explain to me how we can do this.
Right.
Right. But I was not yet 100% convinced we should do that. I was still sorting things out. I was open. Well, about September of 1987, I received a letter from a friend we've been talking about, and he quotes from what we consider the only Vatican Council from the 19th century.
Right.
It states in there that Peter will have a perpetual line of successors in the papacy. You can simplify it, CityVaticanist end.
Right.
So one of my conclusions from that was there will probably be a pope reigning at the final trumpet.
Yes.
We won't be in CityVaticanist. Because some of your CityVaticanists have gone to the extreme of thinking we'll never have another pope.
Oh.
In practice, that's how they act.
Mm-hmm.
Although Bishop Moises Carmona, who was consecrated by Took, went to his grave wanting an election of a pope.
Right.
So, but yes, and I was one of the people who became convinced in 87, but it's not just me. Several of us reached the same conclusion at the same time. One man sent out a letter, and I forget how he got my name. It was probably easy to get because I was in correspondence with like-minded people at that time.
You were already writing at that time, right?
I had written a little bit. I didn't really start writing until we put together a series of articles in summer '88.
Okay.
On electing a pope. We included like Dryden's article. He had already died by this point.
Mm-hmm.
We had articles from several other people, and we kind of filled in the gaps. Because we were trying to sort out, okay, we need to have a papal election because a pope needs to be elected. The church is a perfect society, so it always has, at all times, the means of supplying itself with a head if the papacy is vacant.
Right. And
so that, moving forward, that being determined, we have to figure out how. And that took us from September 87 until the book Will the Catholic Church Survive the 20th Century came out, which covered a large area of things. We did a section on how to interpret church law, a section on heresy. Then we go into Roncalli, that's the second anti-Pope John 23rd in history, the first one being from the Western Schism. Right. And Paul VI were heretics prior to their election. Because those who, there was a book came out, True or False Pope. I'm not sure the authors are members of the society, but they are, the head of the society, Bishop Clay at the time, wrote the introduction or a letter at the beginning of it. In any case, he goes into the vacancy from the proposition that John 23rd became a heretic when he put out Pacem in Terris, and Paul VI became a heretic sometime when he signed the Vatican II document.
Right.
People were somewhat indefinite until they realized, well, that's still an open question. Can a pope become a heretic? And they prove that no, they can't. But by the time they wrote that book, that wasn't our proposition. Our proposition was that a heretic attempted to become pope. Well, that one is, and in fact, you can go on a Society of St. Pius X website. It's an article, Clear Ideas on the Pope's Infallible Magisterium, where they don't believe the bull Cum Ex Apostolaris Official, which is what we base ourselves on, is infallible. It states that a heretic cannot get any office in the Catholic Church. Now, the next statement is, and they go back to someone from the only Vatican Council in the 19th century, discussion says, we don't believe Cum Ex is infallible, but the principle is because it's part of the ordinary magisterium. In other words, everyone is taught a heretic can't get an office in the church, not just Pope Paul IV in that particular bull. He was just restating something that's been held from the time of Christ. So they come from a different direction on that. So all we had to do was prove that John 23rd and Paul VI were heretics prior to their apparent election. Means they never became pope in the first place.
Oh, okay.
And so
not latae sententiae, but something different.
Well, it's latae sententiae, only it happened prior to their apparent election as pope. So they resigned their office, cardinal, bishop, etc., long before they attempted to become pope. They had no office when they walked into the conclave.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm following you now.
Yeah, I know. We cover a lot of ground. That's why I wrote a book.
So then, once you came to this conclusion, this is what led to the conclave actually taking place.
Exactly.
So was it the same people that you were communicating with that then held the conclave that had you elected, or how did that conclave come about specifically for those people? How did you decide as a group that this was going to happen on this day at this time?
Okay. Well, the articles in 1988 were circulated amongst a lot of CityVaticantists. We didn't limit ourselves to those who were conclavists, because we're trying, CityVaticantists, you need to know there's another step we got to go to. That's what we did moving forward. Well, we weren't getting our point across. That's why two of us talking to each other, we've got to put together a whole book. I think it would be written a lot simpler now than it was then. But we want to cover everything, and some of the principles, like right now in my current book, a single sentence might summarize everything we need, but we didn't have that sentence back in the late 80s. So we had to put together a longer proof. So we proved, first, the papacy is vacant, because you can't have a papal election when there's a pope already sitting there.
Very much correct.
Okay. Once we proved that, the next step is going into how can we assemble. Well, part of being a perfect society, the church, the ordinary electors are the cardinals. Well, we've just proven there are no cardinals left, because they all resigned at Vatican II. All right. And anyone appointed after October 9, 1958 weren't appointed to the cardinalate, because the man appointed them wasn't pope. So we proved there are no cardinals. The next step is, that's where you get into some speculation, because it's never happened before. What do you do next? So we looked into church history. How were other papal elections held? Because papal elections seem and appear pretty normal. Okay.
Now,
I mean, we haven't had a really not contested election, a difficult election, several centuries. In fact, we might go back before the Protestant revolt, because once the Protestants revolted, we kind of got our act together. No one messed with papal elections. We didn't have anything complicated. Things just went smoothly. They process into the Sistine Chapel. They vote, and eventually white smoke goes up. It might be short time, long time, but that doesn't really matter.
Yes.
We get back before the Protestant revolt. In fact, as I was thinking about research later on, I realized what you might consider an advance in papal election law came about because of how they had to hold a papal election. In other words, they violated the letter of the law. Take a look at the second longest interregnum way back. They finally decide compromise. They chose like 6 or 7 cardinals. Let's just go elect a pope and let's get out of here. Of course, well, the faithful were kind of tired of waiting.
Yes.
They had boarded up the place. When that didn't work, they took the roof off.
They did.
Yeah, okay. All right. And so finally they said, I'm tired of sitting here in the rain. We got to do something because what we're doing isn't working. Inspiration.
They definitely had to codify from the chaos.
Right. But notice, they violated the letter of the law, which didn't allow for compromise. Well, now that was put into the law. I'm not sure. I know what got me, I think, is Paul VI wrote a papal election law, and he took out inspiration. Here, John the 23rd opened the windows, let the Holy Spirit in, and now we're kicking him out of papal elections. I thought, this is kind of contradictory.
I think Pope Fabian might have something to say about that.
Yeah. Sounds like you folks are probably more up on your history than I am at the moment, because my studies, I'm working on other issues. I mean, I know.
Well, we're all the way back in the 10th century right now. We started with Peter, and we're moving our way, but there are a lot of people to cover.
Right. So, but you already know that there's been some really funny things happen, but the resulting pope was never questioned. Validity.
It's true.
Because there was no reason to question it. So you're already studying that. I don't have to cover all that ground. Although there's some things that you probably haven't got to yet. Because I know one emperor appointed 3 popes in a row. The third one was eventually canonized.
Oh, we're getting close. We're almost there.
I didn't think we were quite there yet.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So that resulted in your conclave, because you've now looked back at the history of how elections are taking place, and this idea of the perfect electorate, and that a church will supply its own head. And resultingly, there is an election on July 16th, 1990.
Correct.
And you are elected.
Right. Well, the book, Will the Catholic Church Survive the 20th Century, we sent to every CityVaticanist group in the world. Because there was something similar there. I think Traditio has a Catholic directory of traditionalist mass centers.
Yeah.
Well, a man out of St. Louis, Radko Jansky, was publishing something similar. And by that time, he would indicate their Society of St. Pius X or their CityVaticanist, or I think he has some other designations. Well, we just blanketed the CityVaticantists, because technically the Society of St. Pius X, in our opinion, is in schism because they are accepting an anti-pope as their pope. They don't pay him, but that's another story. So we didn't approach them.
And did you get a large response when you sent out this information?
No. And that we expected that, because they had already in practice had set up their own, basically, little church, which I cover why we reject the traditionalists. They've created a new kind of priest and bishop, sacramental priests and bishops. In other words, all priests and bishops really do is administer sacraments. Well, that's not how Jesus set up the church. He set up teaching authority, of course, authority to erect dioceses and all this stuff. They say, well, we're in an emergency, we can do whatever we please, which is no. Well, your CityVacantists should all have been conclavists. Because CityVacantes end. But, okay, we got a perfect example happened just the other day. Bishop Daniel Dolan in Cincinnati died. Okay. The bishop who consecrated him, Mark Pivarunas out of Omaha, was there at his funeral. But what's significant, Dolan had just consecrated a bishop to send down to, or from South America, in part just in case he woke up dead one morning, which is
Right.
what happened. Well,
Mm-hmm.
when that bishop came to consecrate his successor to take over in Cincinnati, Bishop Mark Pivarunas was not present. So there's a division between in CityVaticanism. This is just
Right.
one obvious thing.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not even united. Our basic catechism,
Right.
one of the marks of the church is unity,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't have it.
There's a lot of fracture for sure.
Oh, yes. I think Mom ran across the word fissiparius, which means fracturing and fracturing and fracturing. That's what's happened to the whole traditionalist movement, with the
Mm-hmm.
exception of the indult, which in my book, I don't count them as traditionalists. I know they probably do,
Mm.
but I just did that in my particular book to make a distinction. I mean,
Right.
I'm not faulting them, but I thought I start out my right in the introduction. I'm not counting these people in because their situation is different, and I'm not really covering that because it's
Right.
obvious they're in full communion with a man I consider a heretical antipope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's basically just part of the conciliar church, which is why I put that separation there. I'm not criticizing them. I know many of them are great people. They're traditional minded. They are probably going to watch this. They might they'd be studying, which is that's all good. But I made a distinction for my use in that particular work.
Right. Right.
Okay, but yeah, your traditionalists. Well, the society they split up all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the conciliar church has quite a lot of fracture at the moment as well, which we are seeing play
Yes,
out
I've
in real
seen a little
time.
bit of that because it's kind of interesting. If you are part of the conciliar church, Francis is pope, and therefore you have to accept what he legislates. We don't get to pick and choose. I know your recognize and resist group called
Mm.
Sedevacantist Pope Sifters. No, we're not
Mm.
Pope Sifters. We reject the completely.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
we say they're not Pope, therefore we don't have paying attention to them. Recognize and resist as Pope Sifters. As I was it Roman spoken, the case is closed, has now become Roman spoken. The debate is on. Is this traditional or is this
God, the debate is
modern?
definitely on.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, especially since Francis came in.
Very much so, and that's definitely something that we look at. Even though we are covering the 10th century, a lot of the debate around Pope we do cover as we look at the news because it's very pressing on how it impacts perception and historic impact of the Catholic Church.
Well, let's face it. We want to be in Jesus Christ's church, okay? And what Francis is doing is troubling, you know. And some might be saying, is it time to hit the exit because they've
Well,
left us? I mean, this
there's
has
a
got to be. This is a question that's on the table. What do
definitely.
we do with Francis? Benedict appeared more conservative. He really wasn't. He just see that was a shift that occurred in the 70s. The focus was
Hmm.
taken away from the doctrine, which is what I call veterans. Those of us who got out or were starting out even in the 60s. We got out because of doctrine,
Right.
not because of the change in the mass. Although that's
Hmm.
what got our attention and finished pushing us out the door.
Right. Right.
We realized that's no longer the Catholic Church. Well, after Lefebvre came along and your traditionalist priests started setting up, originally they called them mass centers
Hmm.
because uh, they couldn't, under church law, set up chapels or churches or anything like that. They've since
Right.
relaxed on that, although, as I prove from their own statements, they realize they don't have any regular authority in the church. It's all extraordinary.
Right.
So that they may put pastor uh, on the front door of the church and have someone's name underneath. Well, like Dolan did.
Hmm.
Like, but when you read their actual technical stuff, they realize they're not pastor. Well, if they're not pastors, they have no authority over Catholics in any place in the world. They're relying on some emergency authority. And it's questionable whether, like, for instance, the sacrament of confession, which requires not just holy orders, but authority,
Mm-hmm.
are even valid. Some
Well, and it
people.
goes to show how many actual fractures there are at any level of the church,
Mhm.
because this is constantly up for debate, like you're saying.
Right.
So it's not surprising that we're seeing that in the CityVaticanist movement as well. Why you didn't get a large response?
Right. I wasn't surprised. In fact, it was kind of funny. Talking with someone who actually did participate.
Mm.
She asked, "Well, where are we going to hold this?" I said,
That's a good
"Teresa,
question.
yeah, Teresa, we're going to be able to hold this in your living room." And hers was a small living room. Okay, and that's what actually happened.
Was
Uh,
it not a general store?
well, it's actually, yeah, but I mean, size wise, we could have held it in our living room. Yeah, it was in a building my dad owned.
Ah, okay.
Okay, and we just decided to use that because it was convenient.
Right. Now,
Because
out
we
of
wanted to be prepared with the largest place we could
yes,
practically put together.
just in case.
Right, just in case a miracle happened. But I was reasonably certain it'd be very few. But
And
we
just
always hope for the opposite.
out of curiosity, because conclaves notoriously have a secret ballot that never ends up being secret. Do
Yes,
you know the full results of the conclave that elected you?
of course. I was in it
Yeah.
as a voter. Okay,
Are
that
you
the
able to share that?
actually only the Pope can share the results
Yeah.
because he's not bound to the secret. Yeah, it was basically 5-1.
Oh, so almost unanimous. That's pretty.
Well, you never vote for yourself. You're
Mm.
not supposed to. Now, Pius XII changed the regulation to how they could make sure no one voted for themselves in the
Right.
mid 50s sometime.
In the
But
Apostolic Constitution.
right,
Yeah.
but so yeah, it was 5-1.
So were there? This isn't a question I had sent in advance, but I'm curious.
Yeah.
Were there a lot of contenders?
Well, that's
Were you
another
can?
thing. Every Catholic man is eligible to be elected. There are not candidates. Now, I mean, there's like going into any conclave. I mean, there are bets on, but okay, when Francis was elected, I was watching the white smoke go up and stuff, and we were watching it on EWTN. When they come
Yeah.
out, say who was elected in Latin. Well, I got what Georgius, and I didn't catch the last name. Neither did any of the announcers. He was not
Mm.
apparently on their short list because I mean they would be preparing. Okay, what's the first thing they do as soon as they're able to when a new pope's elected in the 20th and 21st centuries? You want to put out a biography of the pope. Well,
Mm-hmm.
you've got yourself a short list. You got people writing on it the second the papacy becomes vacant. I mean, that's just common sense. Your newspapers are doing the same thing. They're getting ready, and then they weren't ready for Bergoglio. They waited until something, like a news release came out of the Vatican before they even announced who had been elected. Now they're scrambling. Let's find some footage on this guy. So they weren't expecting it. Yeah, there are no candidates.
So, but you had someone in mind because you didn't vote for yourself. So you had someone in mind that you thought would be a good fit.
Yes, I did. Well, I didn't vote for myself, so I voted for one of the other men that was present.
Okay.
Because
So,
my
so
personal opinion was that if someone is qualified to be elected, they will actually be present this time. I didn't share that with anyone. Like,
that's a valid
okay,
perspective. Yeah.
I I would say if they weren't present, it was because they had a good reason not to be. But
Mm-hmm.
there've been Saint Peter Celestine. You probably wouldn't have got to him yet. He was a monk. They had to send people out to ask him, "Do you accept
Oh, did
election?"
they ever?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, it's happened in the past that someone not present was elected or
Yes,
not present in the
definitely.
conclave. In fact, I've even read fictional stories on that.
Well,
When,
and that's what you're talking about with acclamation and inspiration, where the divine
right,
spirit comes into
right,
that.
right. Well, it was an actual ballot, one ballot, 5-1, and I lost. That's why I say jokingly. No, the burden was placed upon me.
It was, and as of today, as we are speaking, as Pope Michael, you are now on par with Pius IX for the longest papacy on record.
Yeah, I passed him the other day.
Ah, just the other day.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
it's not on my calendar anymore because I drop off past events. Now I'm going after Peter's reign, and we
See,
aren't sure.
I prepped these questions a month ago. I should have checked and seen if you had passed yet. But that brings us nicely into my next set of questions, which is about your papacy, because I would love to know, what does a day in the life of Pope Michael look like in 2022?
Uh, it depends on the day and what we've got going on. Of course, first thing in the morning is prayers and mass,
Mm-hmm.
which, in fact, I know it's one of the questions you put down. We might as well get to it. You'll notice I'm in a different place right now.
Yes.
Okay. Well, in fact, when I get off of here, I'm checking. We are selling the place we were in because I need to be on one level. I
Oh,
was born with slight back trouble. Well, at my age, it's finally let me know about, and stairs are no longer friendly to me. In any case, it was part of our House of Prayer project we announced a little over a year ago on the olive tree.
mm-hmm.
So I've moved here. In fact, this morning we were talking with the contractor who's converting. He's got an oversized garage. We're converting that to a small church here,
Okay.
and there'll be room eventually for three of us here. Although we probably, well, we're not sure of where some things are going, but
Mm-hmm.
we
Mm-hmm.
may be building a church not too far outside of Topeka here soon.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's
That's
it.
certainly an expansion from the attic chapel
Oh
with
yes,
your
no,
standing computer. I do remember that.
right. Well, we've got a full diocese over in the Philippines.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes,
Well,
Bishop.
that
Bishop of
definitely,
joined us.
wow. So then I can ask you these next questions, because that plays right into that, which is, how large is the true Catholic congregation now, and how much has it grown since your documentary? Sounds
It's
like a lot.
grown significantly. I'm not sure if I've asked the bishop over in the Philippines for a count because we've
Hmm.
got, well, a priest that's with us just inherited a church. Oh, it's almost a year ago now. He lives in St. Louis. It's in South Central Illinois, and that
Is
congregation is 20 or 25.
Oh,
We've got a small mission in Phoenix.
so you've doubled, tripled, quadrupled since your
I would say it's more than that even because
wow.
I haven't. I need to get with the bishop. We ought to take a head count. How many are with us?
Yeah,
And
because in your
these people are actually 100% with us. Then we got those who are sitting on the fence who will probably
Mhm.
watch this, who are like subscribers to the Olive Tree or listen to our podcasts and things, because the
Mhm.
thrust of our ministry is, with the exception, answering these questions, which is why I wrote this book. Our
Mhm.
thrust of our ministry is to bring people to holiness, because
Yeah.
it says in Scripture, the spiritual man judges all things. Well, until they become spiritual, they cannot sort out these things. That's why there's so much confusion out there. Some of these people aren't spiritual. Now, some are,
Right.
because it says,
Or moving
Jesus said,
closer to.
right, well, Jesus said, at these times, even the elect will be deceived.
Mm.
Okay.
Mhm.
And I see that because there's a lot of confusion out there. Because everyone is out there putting out their own take on things. And they can't even
Mhm.
agree, although they might agree on the condition of the papacy. There are three propositions there.
Right.
You've got one, that he is Pope, which that would be everybody in the adult and all those who are with the Society of St. Pius X. And however, yeah, you'd have to check with each priest and or bishop. Okay, where do you stand today on things?
Right.
Williamson and his bunch believe he's Pope. Yeah, Father Pfeiffer just got consecrated a while back. He believes it. Of course, they don't practice it. In
Right.
fact, right after my election, the head of the religion department at KU came over to visit, and he brought up. He says that society position never made any sense to me because it's
Mm.
schizophrenia. You say he's Pope, but then in practice, you're refusing him obedience.
Yeah,
See,
it is a confusing organization for sure.
yeah, because I've written on that. All right, your position needs to be consistent.
Hmm.
Okay, if you believe he's Pope, you better be ready to go hand in hand and sing "Kumbaya" down to the Novus Ordo. Of course, they don't do that anymore. That's
Right.
what. That's one of the things that was coming in late '60s, early '70s.
Hmm.
It got very radical. Of course, people started parish shopping while they're trying to sort things out, looking for a conservative parish. Because I recall there in Oklahoma City, uh, everybody they kept moving south. Well, they went to St. Francis because the pastor there, Monsignor Oldie, was very conservative.
Hmm.
Well, he got too feeble to manage a big parish, so they gave him Holy Angels, which is a little bit further south, and eventually he died. They I never went to my family never went to it, but a lot of families went clear down to South Oklahoma City to some Carmelite church where they had a conservative.
Mm.
And I got thinking at the time, I said, we keep going south, we'll be going to Dallas for mass. And
So, but coming back to
yeah.
your congregation and the fact that it is growing so large, you say you have a bishop now as well. How many priests are part of your congregation? And I have to know, is Phil Friedel still part of your church?
Oh, Phil Friedel's still with us and working with us. Uh, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We've got about 7 priests with us.
Seven priests and a bishop and congregation. So it has come quite a long way since the 2011 documentary.
Oh, yes, it's come a long way. In fact, and it came up just the other day with one of our minor clergy around here. I was
Hmm.
end up visiting him, and he said, "You talked about doing a second documentary.
Mm.
Well, there's certain things we would like to get in a video format, which is
Right.
why I like interviews like this. This gives us an opportunity to communicate and find out well, what do people out there want to know. We want to manage the content. We would
Mhm.
still like to have someone independent working with us to actually make the documentary.
Right,
In other
right. So
words,
that you can
we're
get
not
the
going
outside
to,
perspective.
right. So, because that was one of the things I remember the presentation in the documentary. And Professor Miller over there's one hosted us. He was now he's Professor Emeritus. In any case, he came up
Hmm.
and said something about my documentary crew, and I said, "No, this is not my documentary crew." And he just smiled. Because I doubt the Society of St. Pius X would let an independent documentary crew on their property.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
You because that's the documentary was a great move forward because it showed we're open. I mean,
Hmm.
we're not
Hmm.
trying to hide anything. Okay.
Yes.
And that's what it needs to be.
Well, and should be, and that's one thing that we're particularly passionate about at Pontifex is approaching this to an audience that isn't just a religiously minded audience. We want people to look at the history and understand the movement of popes and the papacy throughout history, even if they've never had any exposure to it prior. So there are a lot of people who will come to this podcast and have never heard of CityVaticanism or conclavism or the Novus Ordo or any of that. And so this will be an entirely fresh take for them.
Right.
And that brings me to my next question, which is aside from the religious organizations, what sort of responses does your papacy received from the general public, maybe even the non-religious public? Because I know you've gone viral a number of times on the internet.
Right. Actually, if you go to anyone but members of the conciliar church or traditionalists, I'm well received.
Mm-hmm.
And these people will know I'm Pope Michael. In
That's how
fact,
I found you.
right. But these are the general people. Well, I got involved in the Oakland Neighborhood Improvement Association here in Topeka.
Mm-hmm.
I'm now its president. And I know
Perfect.
their one board member may not know I'm Pope Michael. We have never discussed it. But the rest of the board I know knows because something came up and I informed them. I said, this could come up because this person is coming to our Neighborhood Improvement Association meeting and I wanted them to have a heads up. And they didn't even comment on it.
Wow. So
They elected me president eventually.
So you don't generally lead with that in the other forums when you're engaging in secular activity. You don't always
Right.
lead
I don't
with.
lead with that. But
Okay.
From the dress, they know I'm something.
So this is your standard daily dress.
Yes, although I do wear secular clothes sometimes. When I became president the first time, the outgoing president recommended that since I'm now representing the whole neighborhood, I might tone it down a bit. And I discussed it with my spiritual director and my clergy, and they agreed with his proposition. So
Right.
that
Seems reasonable.
Right. For instance, if I'm taking meetings with the city, which I did last couple weeks, I'm in lay clothes.
Right.
Now, sometimes I'll show up and I'll be wearing a cassock because I'm stopping by on my way to a religious thing, like to pick something up at the city hall.
Right.
So, they know I'm up to something, and it's not like I hide it.
Right. It's not Batman.
No, it's not Batman. No.
So, and then that sort of ties into my next question as well about how your papacy has changed in the last 30 years. Because obviously there is a level of modernity that comes with living in 2022. So how do we modernize the church in a non-heretical way? And how are you keeping up with the 21st century? Like your book said, how will the Catholic Church survive the 21st century? How are you surviving the 21st century?
Well, okay, the first decade, we were carrying on correspondence and things, but we already knew most of the people, they implicitly rejected us. Contacts were slow.
Right.
Then I heard about this wonderful thing called the internet. And it finally came because I was living outside of Delia, Kansas on 5 acres at the time. Well, the internet finally came in the summer of 99. As soon as it came in, I figured out how to get on it.
Perfect.
Yeah, first you have to learn how to negotiate and all this stuff. And then, someone I had met, she was pulling stuff off the internet like nobody's business. Like, wow, there's a lot of stuff. We got to figure out how we can be on the other side of that, where they're pulling our stuff off. And that's, I started out with Homestead, with just, one of their regular, I think it was free website or something. Then I eventually, the Vatican in Exile was born, and it's evolved through several major revisions to bring it up to date. Of course, as technology moves forward, I do like the armchair videos, which you find on the YouTube channel. I have to ask if he's got a Vimeo channel for that. Yeah. I've got a YouTube channel, but I haven't put anything there in years. But that's the beauty of the internet. Once it's there, it's speaking.
Absolutely.
And plus, like I republished several things I wrote in the 80s. Because I figured, all right, people are looking into what's going on. I want to be open and upfront with them about it. Because this is how my own thinking evolved, how I got to where I am today. And then, of
Mm-hmm.
course, I got, in fact, in the olive tree, they put at least one vintage video, from my own YouTube channel. It could be something from, because when do we get on YouTube? About '09 or 10, somewhere along in there. So that was a learning experience.
So
So,
your
yeah,
online church is older than our whole podcast.
right. What someone noticed is that every time we made a step forward, the Vatican would follow.
Mm.
We
Well,
were first.
interesting, because that's that will sort of tie into this question as well, because I wanted to know if you'd had any contact with the conciliar church at the Vatican, and how aware they are, or how aware you think they are of what you're doing.
Well, I do know the Kansas City Star did an article on the election in '90. They called the Vatican.
Okay.
The response was no comment.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And then nothing happened. Nothing happened. We really haven't crossed paths. Uh, well, there was, I'm not sure if it's in the documentary, one of the conciliar priests came to the presentation in Lawrence at Kansas University.
Yes, I remember that. He was
Okay.
very, very amped up, steamed about what had to be said.
Yes, it was be expected. Well, you got a little backstory on him. When he gets up and introduces himself, I already know where he's from.
Mm-hmm.
I knew his grandfather. He lived in St. Mary's, Kansas. He
Mm.
grew up right next to seeing the society and all the craziness that went on there. So he
Mm.
already had a background into this.
Fair. That
Yeah,
that
I
makes
thought
it make sense. I thought
he
he was
was
unnecessarily aggressive in just that context of the video.
right. So I've met I've met him. I just met the priest at Christ the King Church here in Topeka. Uh, well, I have a small mission at Thornton Place, where Mom
Mm-hmm.
lives. We have mass every Sunday morning. Well, in addition to that, I'm working with a few people, and this one gal had some personal problems, and she was trying to decide: do I want to go with the priest from Christ the King, or do I want to go with him?
Or Pope
And
Michael.
right, and so just so happened I was just getting ready to leave when the priest from Christ the King walked in. So the three of us were visiting, and she brought up one of the issues, and he was actually agreeing with me on whatever the point was. And I really shouldn't talk about it because that's personal. And then
Mm-hmm.
we're walking out together, and he thanked me for my ministry at Thornton.
Wow. So
Mm-hmm.
he's definitely simmered a little bit in terms
Well,
of
this is a
discussing
different
his
priest,
points.
yeah.
Yeah.
Those would be the only two contacts I've really had with the conciliar church. Not that I wouldn't talk with anyone. I've seen the
Right.
local pastor from afar. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, yeah, he was across the street at the Seward Avenue dedication.
Do you have any contact or engagement with non-Christian religions? Have they responded to your papacy at all?
Uh, Not really. I have given some interesting presentations. If I can work it into the schedule,
Mm-hmm.
I will. I addressed a group. They labeled themselves as skeptics. The man who
Okay.
invited me was an atheist.
Mm.
So I put together a presentation. That's when I got my two stick figures. I used them for the first time there,
Right.
showing the difference. Uh, of course, one of the people there was hot about the pedophile crisis. This was,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I went over there in 13, yeah.
Okay.
So we
Well,
got
and
Q&A to a big thing on the pedophile crisis.
which it should be certainly an open topic of conversation, although it doesn't seem that you would have as much influence or impact in that
Right.
particularly.
Yeah, she was connecting me with them, maybe. But yeah, I can understand why people are upset. All right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
hmm And so I just pointed out because this is a perfect time to show the difference between the 1983 code and 1917 code of canon law.
Mm-hmm.
1983 code simply says that a pedophile priest will be punished with a just punishment. And so the way they act, I guess, moving him across town is considered punishment enough. Whereas the 1917 code, bishop has no choice. He's got to pull the priest because
Absolutely.
it's the late sententia again. He is, let's see, excommunicated and suspended from all function as a cleric.
Right.
So
Interesting.
the only
That's
way he
something
can be restored is it'd have to go clear to Rome.
Right.
Every case would be judged in Rome. I mean, the bishop might be asked to gather evidence, but the case would have to go to Rome. So they wouldn't be restored.
Well, and that's definitely something that we intend to cover in quite a lot of detail because there has been a lot of canonical changes in the conciliar church regarding that right now, and so it will be interesting to see that history. I haven't heard that before, so that's
right.
I'm making a mental note of something to add to my research for that.
Right.
Now,
I can recall Mom when they used to broadcast the Bishops' Conference here on EWTN.
Mm-hmm.
They went into a big, long thing to deal with the pedophile crisis. I mean, they set up a system that was going to sound. I happen to be gone on a trip. I get home, Mom tells me, I think if this goes in, it'll help.
This is the PCB 2019 conference?
Oh, no. This is way back.
Oh, okay.
15, 20 years ago.
Okay.
In any case, John Paul II was still in. They send it to Rome for approval.
Right.
Rome kicks it back. This has insufficient due process of law and threw the whole thing out. Nothing was done. I mean, and something needed to be done.
And that's where a lot of the criticism comes in about being very angry about the conciliar church's response and their failure to respond appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
So, on the flip side of that, I'm curious, beyond the theological and doctrinal points, which are clearly the most foundational in this moment, is there anything that Francis is doing that you approve of?
I have seen a couple of things he's done. I couldn't tell you right now, but I'd run across it and say, well, I tend to have to agree with that. I mean, even a broken clock is right twice a day. He's not going to get everything wrong. He's going to do some things that I agree with. And because that's some of your, well, have you heard of radical traditionalism?
I've definitely seen the rad trad, mostly on Twitter, but yes.
Well, so someone that was with us for a while sent me an article and wanted me to refute it about radical traditionalism. I'm reading. Well, I can't refute it because that's not us. He was thinking that's what he wanted to be. Well, we're not radical traditionalists, okay?
Right.
I mean, we're Catholics, and on some issues, we don't speak much because you already know where we stand on that just from where we're standing in general. The church's teaching is already clear. So why should I waste my time on we'll take the issue of abortion, Roe versus Wade. Okay. I don't know.
Very topical.
Yeah, especially with the reversal. Now I was talking with someone and said it should be reversed, but not for the moral issue. It's just a bad decision. I mean, the original Supreme Court overstepped their bounds. It didn't make sense. I mean, this even came up I think it was when Bork was nominated to the Supreme Court. This came up, and he just said it's a bad decision. He didn't get into
the actual precedent that was set. That's what you're referring to.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And I tend to agree. It needed to be reversed. But
to be reworked at very least.
No, right? You have to throw, because the Supreme Court shouldn't be making this decision. The Constitution is clear. Anything not specifically given to the federal government is left to the states or the people. Now, I'm not sure
Ah,
saying that the states are going to get it right. I'm afraid they're going to get it wrong. And as a people, at least in parts of this country, we're going to commit the sin of approving abortion in some manner. That is a
okay.
sin. Until recently, that sin was on 9 people on the Supreme Court. Was it a half
Hmm.
century ago or so? About that.
Yeah, well, and it represents that idea of governmental jurisdiction. And actually, I have some questions on that as well
Okay.
as we get into the idea of the conciliar church and beyond, and the role of papal politics and whatnot. The role of pope has almost always been one that is intrinsically tied with secular and political power, from like a temporal influence in Rome to a dominant sovereign in a modern landscape. So in the 2020s, how political should the Pope be?
Well, basically, uh, we got to stay out of politics. All right.
So you think a Pope shouldn't be political at this
Right. Well,
stage?
not at this time because we're back in persecution. It's a different kind of persecution, but we're back in the persecutions again. The first 3 centuries, when the only nice thing is we're not in the catacombs. At
That is
least
true.
we're above ground level.
I just did a presentation about those early popes living in the catacombs last weekend. So,
Right. So we are here more about the spiritual, and that
mhm.
till there's a restoration, which might not come until after Antichrist has come and gone,
Mm.
we won't be back into the political arena.
So, what about papal infallibility? Do you think the Pope is infallible?
Yes.
Okay. And what
Hmm.
about papal resignation? Should the Pope ever retire or abdicate?
Uh, there would be cases when it has happened. One pope that resigned was eventually canonized because that was that monk I was telling you about. He
Celestine the
was in
Fifth.
there was like, I can't handle this thing. I
I
quit.
love
Right?
I love the
Uh,
story of Celestine the Fifth. He's such an interesting pope because he
he is.
absolutely had no desire to be pope whatsoever.
Right. Uh, because, well, you probably studied about the pope who sold the papacy to another pope.
It's
And
coming.
then,
Yep,
then someone
Benedict the
got there,
Ninth.
the other guy said, you really should have resigned, and we get this straightened out. So he resigned. Gregory the 12th resigned to help end the Western Schism. So, I mean, there are occasions when a pope not only can resign, because it's right in the Code of Canon Law,
Hmm.
at least why it's 17. I haven't read that part of the 83. I do own a copy.
Do you have a plan to retire, or will you stay pope until you're not of this earth anymore?
Until death do us part, like in marriage. No, I have no plans to resign.
Okay.
I
And
mean, there were a couple of failed movements among the CityVaticanist around the turn of the century to try and get the CityVaticanist together and have a universally recognized election.
right,
Now, if that had come off at a certain point, yes, I would resign in favor of it. But my
like
decision was because the reason for resigning is not for personal benefit, but
yes,
for the good of the church. And if it's
to
necessary to step out of the way, but the way the attitudes are now, there's no real movement. I mean, there is a movement. There's a website, Pray for the Pope, prayforapope.com, which is run by, well, I'm not sure if they're sedevacantist or not.
mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, there's a sede occupantis, those that believe Francis is Pope, which you'd have those in the conciliar church, and the Indult and the Society of St. Pius X and some others represent the rest of that group. Then you have I wouldn't call it a theory because second I read it the first time, I said, I know one thing for sure, this isn't right. It's called the material formal thesis or the Cassiacum thesis. It's called Sede Privationism. What they teach is that Francis is materially Pope because he was elected, but not formally Pope because he can't formally become Pope until he ceases to be a heretic.
Oh, okay.
All right. Now,
Yes.
at one point, the CityVaticanist were saying that is part of CityVacantism. And I said, hold it just a darn minute. That's not CityVacantism. They're like
No.
the Society of St. Pius X and the Recognize and Resist. They're waiting for the
Mhm.
conversion of George Bergoglio so he can become Pope Francis.
Right.
It's
Right.
just their position on whether he's fully in or not, that's where it varies.
It's almost like a reversal of ex cathedra and the idea of papal infallibility.
Right.
Interesting.
Exactly. And so I put them over there.
Right.
Well, apparently it was a split between Dolan and Sanborn.
Mhm.
Sanborn is a Sede Privationist, and Dolan was a solid Sede Vacantis. He was a Sede Vacantis in 1978. He
Mhm.
gave the
Mhm.
retreat when I was in seminary with the society at Armada, Michigan. Silent retreat until his conference on Sede Vacantism. That
Hmm.
blew the silence. Well, I mean, it stirred everybody up. But yeah, he was, well, a lot of those in Econ in the 70s
Mhm.
were Sede Vacantists in their heart, although the practice was to pray for Paul VI when I was over there in 77. I
Right.
mean, that
Right.
was
And
always,
trying to.
yeah, I mean, they still pray for Francis now in
Mm.
their public liturgy, as best I know. I haven't seen, I see they have a podcast on it, but I'm sure they do because that's their practice. Although in the Society of St. Pius X, there are a number of Sedevacantists. I keep
Hmm.
hearing that from other people. Yeah.
People coming through the journey of reconciling exactly what they believe and trying to find the right place to fit, I imagine, is a
Well,
lot of that.
basically, yeah, they and what? So, if you're a Sedevacantist, why do you stay with the society? I can't figure that
Right.
because that's another inconsistency. But it's a matter of fact, and it's not something I've heard from one person. I hear it all the
Mhm.
time when
Hmm.
I'm talking with someone who's either with us or we just have gotten in contact. But okay, then you got Sedevacantism that completely rejects everything there. But have you ever
It
heard of a
just
website called Novus Ordo Watch?
I don't know if I have.
It's an interesting website. You might want to visit it. They're the ones who sponsor PrayForAPope.com. They want an in, but they just throw up their hands. They just published something. In fact, my bishop in the Philippines sent me email. What do you think of this article? It's on Novus Ordo Watch. They were supporting the material formal thesis
Oh.
as a
Well, that's quite a
possible expert.
switch.
Well, they're believing it's a part of Sedevacantism.
Mhm.
Okay, because well, it was I think Chicada started. Although right after Father Chicada died, Bishop Dolan, Bishop Sanborn split. I didn't know
Right.
that until right after Bishop Dolan died. I was looking some.
Mhm.
Oh wow. Well, maybe no. It was before he died because I was looking up stuff to respond to my bishop. He said, "This is craziness, but I don't know where to go with it." Well, I need to polish that up. But in about 3 hours, I put together a document to show him everything because that's the type of stuff I have to keep in my mind when these questions come up because
Right.
he needs an answer yesterday
Right. Exactly.
because he's dealing with priests and people over there, and
Speaking
yes,
Speaking of priests and people,
mhm.
one of the major issues that we're seeing a lot of conversation around, particularly in light of the sex abuse scandal of the conciliar church, is clerical celibacy. Why is it a must in the Catholic Church, and is this something you support?
uh, basically, we didn't always have clerical celibacy.
Definitely not.
Although, yeah, you run into people, and I'm not just talking now. Uh, if I went over and got Denziger's Enchiridion Symbolorum, which is basically Henry Denziger is the originator of it, and
Hmm.
he compiled all the documents from the Vatican, the popes, that affected faith and morals in his opinion.
Hmm.
You can look up celibacy and there are documents in there. They're treating it like it's a doctrine. Well, celibacy is not a doctrine.
It is not. And it hasn't been from the beginning.
No, it is a practice more in the West than the East.
Yes, also that.
Okay, well, all right. Considering the problems men with vocations have,
Mm-hmm.
because the society doesn't really support vocations like they say they do. A lot
Fair.
they've tossed a lot of seminarians out on their ears for no good reason, including
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, well, all five of us that went to Econ, with one exception, from the United States in '77, were tossed down their ear. The other one, I ran into him later. He said, "No, I quit because I don't think I have a vocation," and that's perfectly acceptable. But
Sure.
some of these people, they get tossed down their ear because back in the '70s, if you want to be a priest, it was the society or go to the old Catholics or try some place totally different.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, they just gave up and got married.
Ah, well,
Well, might they not still have a vocation?
right. Right.
I mean, I thought about marriage in the mid '80s. If I'm not going to be
Mm-hmm.
a priest, I don't want to be single all my life. So I mean,
So
I entertained the thought.
right. So do you think it's necessary? Like of your priests and your bishops, is this something that you still advocate in your Catholic Church?
No,
Huh.
I have actually. We will permit married men into the priesthood. Okay.
Yeah.
In fact, Father Francis Dominic, who works with me,
Mm-hmm.
was married long before his conversion. His wife is still alive. So
Mm.
technically, he's a married priest. And if she would ever reconcile with him, because he asked that a while back, what if she reconciled? Well, you're married in the eyes of
Right.
God.
Right.
And we accepted you in to the priesthood with knowing this. Yeah,
Yes.
I'm friends with, well, several priests they're not in the church, but they're very supportive of us, who are
Mm-hmm.
married.
I
And
think that's interesting because it's a very big sticking point for a lot of people when dealing with with the conciliar church, that this is such a hard and fast mandate is problematic.
it, yes, I don't think having married priests would eliminate the pedophile problem.
It's not the
You know,
only answer to that
that's one of the
situation
reasons
for
I
sure.
bring it up.
Absolutely.
But they've accepted married deacons.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when that came out, whenever it was, I thought, you know, I'm for that idea. So you asked earlier, it's not Francis. It was under John Paul II, I think, wasn't it?
Mm,
Well, I've
I think
been,
so.
yeah,
My
I'll have to look it up.
my co-host, her father is a married deacon in the church.
Okay.
So yeah.
Mom's got two cousins who are married deacons.
Ah.
If
So it's definitely something that you support then. I that's
Yes, I support married men in the priesthood. Because if they have a vocation, and of course the wife must be cooperating with all this or
Mhm.
out of the
Mhm.
picture. But yes, that's one thing I think we do need to do, and we are doing it.
So a follow up on that as well. What about the role of women in the Catholic Church in terms of women deacons, women priests? Is this something you'd like to see in the Catholic Church, or
Well,
you still
if
have?
if Jesus was going to have women in the clergy, he would have ordained and consecrated his mother. Because who would be more worthy to be a priest? No, that women will not be in the ministry in that manner.
Right. Okay. So that is still something you view, you set your traditional precedent on that back to the apostles.
Right.
Okay. So that is a lovely segue to our last section because you have graciously given us quite a lot of time today. But
Yeah.
I am very excited to talk to you for a moment about papal history because
Okay.
that's our real jam. And
Yes.
so I want to know, who is your favorite pope in history?
I was looking over those questions, and I couldn't narrow it down to one. I like a lot of the popes, I haven't been much in papal history in 30 years. I was more
Fair.
into it before the election, looking in for precedents for the election. And then
Mm-hmm.
we have a 2-volume set of Lives of the Popes, which I read way back trying to get ideas. You know, can I find out how did they handle these things? I got through the
Mm-hmm.
first volume, a little bit into the second volume, and I realized, yeah, I learned a lot of stuff, but nobody dealt with what I have to deal with. Really,
Definitely a different scenario.
I don't think I had a note one that helped me. Well, I can remember when discovered Saint Bernard's Day Consideratione, who was
Mm-hmm.
Pope Eugene III.
Okay.
Wonderful book. Not helpful for running the church in the late 20th, early 21st century because nobody's dealt with the problems I deal with. So I don't spend as much time in papal history.
Right.
My time is spent in looking at, okay, how can we apply scripture and the fathers to today, which is questions like celibacy.
Right. Right. So taking their doctrinal legacies more than necessarily their historical legacy.
Right.
Is there a pope that you can think of that stands out as having had an incredible impact on the church that you look to, whether that be doctrinal or based on election or anything like that that stands out to you?
Uh, I like Gregory the Great in that regard because I'm into his stuff some. Let's see. Yeah.
Gregory has definitely he is because we score our popes on a on a series of silly categories, but Gregory is up there in the highest of scores. I think he's currently in second place.
Oh, okay. Who's first?
Pope Damasus the First, because we also mark on scandal. So Pope Damasus received a lot of points for scandal.
Oh, okay. It must be interesting categories.
They are, and they're a fun way to sort of subjectively bring about the end of our show. So
Well, it's a it's a way of getting to know your subjects better. I mean,
mhm.
history can be dry, but it doesn't have to be.
And papal history certainly isn't, especially when you start to factor in things like personality and impact on history,
Yes.
aside from doctrine and theology, because we have popes who have stories about being murdered by ghosts or
Hmm.
just,
Okay. Right. I
and
mean,
that's in
it's
the
a
record.
fascinating history. It's just not one, you know, when I read it, but I realized I need to be over trying to figure out how how do we move forward from 1990 into when
Into a more modern.
right. So
Mhm.
okay, what things because that's well, your traditions are bad about it. They are taking things like celibacy, which even the conciliar church still holds on to, and turned it into a big T tradition, in other words, a doctrine, when it's a small
Right.
T tradition. I I know I like the idea of celibacy, but I don't
Mhm.
think at this point the church needs to enforce it.
Right. Right.
We those
And
who
there are married popes. There were popes who had wives. Absolutely.
yeah, I was looking that up a while back for something I was working on. Yeah, popes who had children, some were legitimate,
Yes.
and some were illegitimate.
And some of their sons became popes later on.
Right? What was it? One woman was mother, grandmother, and great grandmother to 3 different popes.
Right in the middle of the pornocracy, that is Marozia, and we're dealing with Sylvester
Yes,
the First. No, sorry, not Sylvester. Sergius.
right.
Sergius and the Johns. Yes, I've just written those episodes.
Oh, okay, right. But yes, it is a fascinating history, and so you're bringing in, modern things because apparently your audience wants to find out about Pope Michael. So we had to jump a
Absolutely.
whole millennium.
Yes, and we did just for you. And I interestingly, if we ever get a chance to come back and talk to you, I'd love to talk to you about someone like Pope Honorius the First, who was in fact excommunicated as a heretic posthumously, and how that plays into that idea of a pope being a heretic, or someone like
Well,
Sylvester the Second.
he was not excommunicated for heresy.
Uh,
You need to go to St. Robert Bellarmine, analyze each and every alleged case of papal heresy, and prove that was not what was going on.
well, and we very much argued in favor of Honorius because we believed he was very unfairly treated for that condemnation. So I will read
But yeah,
that.
Robert Bellarmine's already done the legwork on that, because until 1958, since his time, there has not been a case of an alleged papal heresy. They were all prior to him. Yeah, Honorius would be one of them. I'd have to go back. I'm not sure. Maybe, probably, yeah, I touched on that in this book. But yeah, I've got research on that, because that came up, and what pushed it forward is in the early days of traditionalism, those who started saying, well, no, Paul VI is still Pope, said, oh, lots of popes were heretics, and Honorius always top the list.
Yeah, well, of course he would be.
Yeah. Parsons Church history is great on some of these.
I will have to check that out. We actually ended up, I just checked, because Pope Gregory the Great is in 3rd place and Honorius is in 2nd place, because I think we were very fond of him and how unfairly he was treated. So he scored very well.
Okay, good.
In our show.
Well, how are they going to score?
Well, we're going to have to. So I'll give you our categories and you can tell me where you think you will score the best.
Okay.
Because this is where the fun comes in. So we have Papatum and Phallium, which is a category in which we judge their impact on the papacy as a whole. So how they evaluate or how they contribute to papal infallibility, papal prestige, the continuation of the church, and the church's authority. Then we have Fructus Prohibitum, where we judge the scandal, all of their bad behavior.
Okay.
Then we have Seculari Impactum, which is their impact with the secular world. Are they leading the conversion efforts? Are they having interesting relations with monarchs? And are they facilitating wars? Those kind of things. Then we have Facium Sanctus, where we rate their face. We take your official portrait and we'll decide how many points your face gets. And then we have a canon bonus round. If you are a saint, we give you an extra point. And
well, I can't win that one.
And then we have
one pony to be a saint. I'm not dead yet. They can't canonize me.
Exactly. But we also have Tempus Pontificus, and this will definitely be a category for you because you get points based on how long you've been Pope for.
Oh, wow.
So I actually did the calculation on that one for you, and your Tempus Pontificus score would be a 7.75, which is only topped by the legendary St. Peter.
Okay. You might just put it out for the fun.
I
would. I mean, that'd be something I would share, probably like in an armchair or something. Showing the lighter side.
Scores? Yes.
Yeah, sure. Why not? I mean,
we could have you come and rate yourself.
That's one of the reasons we're doing some of these, things. Like people need to realize that popes are real people. And we have a lighter side.
And that's very much a huge element of our show, and why we also rate on Scandal, because it's representative of a lot of the personality that comes out. And we very much enjoy that. So yes, popes are real people, and that is very much our message.
Right. Okay, that's a good message. And I'm glad to contribute a little something to that idea.
Absolutely. Well, that kind of wraps the last question that I want to ask you today, which is a great question to end on. And as a real person and as a pope, what are your goals for the true Catholic Church moving forward?
Well, that's what we're working on now, is establishing the House of Prayer here, which we may, depending on what goes on, I may be here at times alone. Because everybody else is out somewhere else. But we're wanting to help people improve and increase their prayer life. Okay, because what's the goal here? We all want to be saints, not necessarily canonized. I doubt I'll be canonized. I'm not sure we'll even last that long, but the world.
Well, if you do end up as a saint, we also currently award saints their own patronage based on whatever we've decided is the most interesting thing about them.
Oh,
We
okay.
have the patron saints of Wiggly Foods and what else do we have? Physical manifestations of stress and unfortunate eye injuries. So maybe at least you'll be a patron saint to us. We'll award you something.
Okay, that'd be fun too. See, yeah. I'm looking forward to getting the link to this to share with everybody.
Absolutely, I will make sure that it comes directly to you.
Okay, that sounds good.
Well, on that note, Pope Michael, thank you so much for all of your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to me today and to explain all of the points of the true Catholic Church as led by Pope Michael. So as a final note, where can people find you if they want to listen to your armchairs or read what you've written?
VaticanInExile.com. The N being IN, because that's the original website after we got it. Well, Homestead originally hosted. We've moved to a different host for a more professional look. And we have accomplished something. The search engine now works great on the website. We had issues with that because most people put up a 3-page website.
Right.
I hate to think how many pages are in there. I get in. I don't do much actually in the website, but when I'm in there, it's like, oh boy. I have trouble finding things on the website.
Oh, I believe it. We constantly put off putting together a website because we already have over 100 episodes, and it's going to be a lot of work. And so I can only imagine everything that you've written for the last 30 years on a website.
Right. It's not all on the website. Basically, the website was redesigned in, let's see, we started that in 2016. Okay. You can go to archive and find the older ones.
Right. But now they will know where to find you and to come and read your articles and see your sermons. And so that's fantastic.
Okay. Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of that.
Okay.